the teacher asks the observer, "That wasn't terrible, was it?" And she kind of hesitates and goes, "No." And then there's a pause. And then he says, "I mean, was it that bad?" And she says, "Well, I'd be concerned if an Ofsted inspector was in the room." And the deflation that teacher then had based on that was really hard to watch. She'd left the room. He was left there to kind of shuffle around, picking up the remnants of his lesson. And my thinking was, that's just left him in a place where he thinks he's rubbish. Hello, I'm Tom Rogers, and this is the Rebel Education Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Education Podcast this Thursday afternoon. This podcast, I want to focus on talking about the school. It was a documentary by the BBC. We're on to the third episode, and the episode that came out last night was entitled, was all focused on Ofsted, the impact of Ofsted on a school community, the impact of cuts on a school community in a relatively deprived area. Marwood School was the name of the school. The head teacher was a Mr. Pope. The documentary began by introducing us to the staff, some of the members of staff. And one of the first things that you notice was the impact of cuts on the school. We had a discussion halfway through the programme between the head teacher and the assistant head teacher about merging two classes together to create a class of 40 plus, an MFL class of 40 plus in the same room. And this was a serious consideration. It was not a kind of throwaway comment. It was a serious consideration, which then went through to a panel of the three MFL teachers who had their say. When the head presented this idea of merging the two classes, the reaction was predictable. It was one of dismay, one of disbelief. We cannot merge these groups. It would be a disaster. The progress of students would drop off. The behaviour would be very difficult to manage. All the things you would expect the teachers to say was said. At the very end of the programme, we hear that they didn't do that in the end. But the mere fact that they were considering it just shows the pressure that schools are under in terms of pupil numbers, combined with the inability to hire more staff. That's not just in terms of the salaries that they need to pay, but the fact of the availability of staff, because we hear in the programme that the school didn't have one applicant for a history role and 0 applicants for 2 science positions. And this is not unheard of. I know for a fact that there are so many schools in the UK that are struggling to get any applicants for not just STEM subjects, but history, geography, lots of subjects struggling to recruit. And we know that they're struggling to meet teacher training targets as well. We know that year after year they're failing to hit those targets. They're offering bigger and bigger bursaries to people to come and be teachers in maths and science. We know all these things, but what we also know from this programme is things are not improving. Things are actually getting worse, if anything. Now, the cuts are one aspect of things that the programme touched upon. The other aspect is accountability. We see in the first 10 minutes that the assistant head teacher for teaching and learning has introduced, quote, more observations leading up to an Ofsted inspection. Well, there's several issues I have with that. The first one is that even Ofsted in its current form are not as interested in looking at individual lessons. They certainly don't technically grade lessons anymore during an inspection cycle. So the idea of lesson observations, whole lesson observations, as in coming in from start to finish, and I wouldn't say offering a judgment, but making judgments within that 50 minutes or an hour, is old hat now, really. Even for Ofsted, it's old hat. What Ofsted are interested in is data, is pupil progress. And And that comes with its own issues, and that's why Ofsted are introducing its new framework to change their focus away from looking at attainment and progress towards looking at curriculum models and their impact. And it seems to be that the buzzword around Ofsted at the moment is knowledge and knowledge-rich curriculums and so on. So what kind of curriculum model they'll be looking for is open for debate, but they're certainly going to interrogate school leaders about curriculum. They're going to look in classrooms about curriculum. Everything's going to be about the thought behind curriculum documentation and the thought behind schemes of work, the overarching themes, what students know in year 7 compared to what they know in year 11, and where everything links together. These are very complex things, and making a judgment, again, I worry that that's going to be a very subjective judgment. They're going to have 2-day visits, as they do now. How are they going to make these judgments on curriculum? I mean, that's another story. But anyway, in this particular program, we have an observation. It's a one-off lesson observation, which are, for me, fraught with problems anyway. And we see the senior leader talking to a student in the class, asking the student, is the behaviour normally like this? And the student responds, well, no, it's not normally like this. The behaviour is usually worse. And at that moment, I felt sorry for the teacher, you know. Because, you know, the senior leader's starting to write things down in her notepad about what the student's telling her. I'm sure she's not going to take it on face value. But there is that feeling when that happens of judgment and a one-off judgment being made, and a judgment being made, I don't know, being made kind of lightly or unfairly. I don't know, but it's difficult. But anyway, what I found, I mean, whether there were weaknesses in the lesson or not, because we didn't see in the documentary the whole lesson, we just saw snippets. But whether there were weaknesses or not, and I'm sure there were, at the end we have a conversation in the feedback where the teacher asks the observer, that wasn't terrible, was it? And she kind of hesitates and goes, no. And then there's a pause. And then he says, I mean, you know, was it that bad? And she says, well, I'd be concerned if an Ofsted inspector was in the room. And the deflation that teacher then had based on that was really hard to watch. You know, she'd left the room, he was left there to kind of shuffle around, picking up the remnants of his lesson. And my thinking was, that's just left him in a place where he thinks he's rubbish at his job, and that's not developmental, that's judgmental. And whether there's a grade that's been given or not, a judgment's been made. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'd love to know other people's thoughts on that particular bit, but I felt uncomfortable. I didn't like it. And I know it happens so often in the UK, that kind of thing. I mean, duplications of those moments. And some people would say, well, that's raising standards of teaching and learning. Well, not if that teacher spirals into a lack of confidence, anxiety, and ends up quitting the profession. That's not raising teaching standards. That's doing nothing but causing untold suffering to the kids, because they're the ones who are going to lose out in the long run. That's not a comment on how good that teacher is, because I have no idea. That's just a comment on what happens when teachers quit, or what happens when they go off with stress. And we hear that in that school, we got loads of teachers off with stress. It says in the programme that 2/3 of the history department have gone off on stress, left the school, whatever. So straight away you're losing, and then they're having to put generic non-specialist supply teachers in front of those kids. And it was shocking to hear that the cover supervisor, who's not a trained teacher, who's an administrator, is having to go into classrooms just to supervise kids because they don't want to bring in supply. The other thing that it touched on, which I find really frustrating, is how much these agencies are making a killing out of this situation. We have agencies charging £2 to £2.50 a day for a supply teacher. The teacher might get £100 of that, £110. They're making, what, £100 a day every time a teacher's off with stress? And they are making a killing, some of these companies. It's not right. It's not right. It's just business. And it was so sad to see his reaction to that lesson observation. You wondered in the rest of the documentary he seemed fine, but you just think the pressure that these people are under, eventually they crack. They're human beings. Anyway, in another one of the meetings in the programme, we hear that, they're talking about redundancies, and then we hear the phrase, well, there's a few we would want to leave, hint, hint. And again, this is about judgments made on teachers, teaching and learning standards. I have issues about linking teacher performance with student results, well documented, concerns about that. If you want to find my articles on the TES, they're on there. So at the end of the programme, we see that the Ofsted come back after 12 weeks. They had the provisional visit. They put the school in special measures. It was, inadequate in the inspection. They came back after 12 weeks for a second round visit. Again, they don't see any progress, enough progress made. And this word progress keeps coming up again and again. Rapid progress, I think the inspector said. Rapid improvement. Well, how can you improve things in 12 weeks with the amount of cuts they were talking about in that programme? You tell me. How can you improve a school in 12 weeks under that kind of... It's just... And if someone does improve, in inverted commas, the school in 12 weeks, it's not going to be a lasting change. It's a superficial thing. I might even say that for a year, to be honest. Never mind 12 weeks. So anyway... They come in for the second inspection. Halfway through, they publish this interim report or interim letter where they basically said you're going to fail. And the head teacher decides to quit. He's been there for 4 or 5 years. Quit. Gives the reason as family reasons. His family can't take it anymore. He looked like a broken man in that programme. He looked shattered, in my opinion. And this is what we're doing. And then we have... Amanda Spielman coming out saying you couldn't fill a bus with head teachers who've quit. Well, there's one. I'm sorry, but I can think of at least 10 on Twitter straight away who've left because of these kind of situations where the school's been rated inadequate or requires improvement. Watching that program, I'm sorry, but yes, we don't know what the strengths and weaknesses of that head teacher is or was, but what we do know is he's trying his best and the staff are trying their best, and I would challenge any of those Ofsted inspectors to have gone into that school and made that school better than what those people were doing. I would bet £1,000 of my own money that they couldn't make it any better in 12 weeks than what it was. And yet they published this damning letter and report which leads to this head teacher quitting. How sad is that? How sickening is that? To be honest, it makes me angry just talking about it, and I'm passionate about all teachers in the UK and around the world getting a better deal, and to me that was just sickening to watch. We're wasting people. And it said, he's going to become an education consultant. Well, he probably will, and then he'll get told he's not good enough at that as well because his last inspection was inadequate. So I know of one or two again on social media who were almost dismissed because of their last inspection report. It's Ofsted grading, and it's so damaging to the profession. This outstanding good requires improvement, inadequate. It's sticking. In the new framework, the gradings are still going to be there. So anyway, it was sad to see this guy leave. It was sad to see that the assistant head teacher for teaching and learning also said she was leaving at the end of the programme. Someone retired. Someone left the school and wasn't being replaced on the senior leadership team. So again, more cuts. And we've seen on previous programmes the problems with TAs and not having enough TAs, and God, the list goes on. So it just presented a very bleak picture. What are the shoots of hope? What are the bits of hope in there for British education and teachers? There weren't many. The kids, every programme I've watched of the three, I've seen brilliant kids. It reminded me of my 8 years in the UK. Brilliant kids, generally want to learn. Yes, there's some challenging behaviour there, and I do think you need to be a strong teacher. I do think you need to have that grasp of classroom management. We'll talk about that on other podcasts. But at the end of the day, there's good kids there, and it ain't a bad deal teaching them. Kids are kids at the end of the day. But if you add pressure into the mix, it can create a very unenjoyable environment for teachers who are worried about their next observation or their next work scrutiny or whatever it may be. it's just adding to the pressure, and then teaching becomes unenjoyable. And I'm trying to work out what the shoots of hope are from that program. It was just desperate, some of it, really, and it is not an anomaly. It's something. I mean, I've written 100 blogs for the TES, very active on social media. I get a lot of teachers contacting me, telling me this is happening in their schools. I had one just today contact me to talk about this. So it's not an anomaly. It's happening all over the shop. What needs to change? Well, based on the programme and based on everything, number one for me is abolish Ofsted. I said that in a previous podcast. Get rid of them. Save the 134 million quid. Reinvest it. Have a peer-to-peer review where schools work together to review each other. Scrap accountability based on results, which is the pillar of the whole system, really, as far as the government's concerned. Scrap that. Scrap league tables. Get back to learning, and to be fair to Amanda Spielman, some of the noises she's made is around trying to do that. But I really don't see how you can keep the grading structure as it is, which they're doing, and judge long-term learning. I just don't know if the two can go hand in hand. I'd love to hear from someone from Ofsted to tell me they can, but from my perspective, I'm not sure. So there's some changes I'd like to see. And I honestly believe if you make those changes, which would be free and would actually save money, I think you'd see so many teachers come back into teaching. I think you'd see lots of international teachers come back to the UK, or at least consider it. And I just think you'd start seeing trainee teachers. You'd start seeing more and more trainees. You'd start to see hitting those targets. Much less pressure within school buildings, much more freedom, much more innovation, much less time wasted on accountability frameworks and systems, on, teachers walking around with clipboards and having to do tick box processes. A lot of that would go out the window. Performance management documentation. Oh God, I could think of like a million things that would change if you did those two things. Scrap Ofsted, scrap performance tables based on results. Do those two things, huge raft of changes we would see. The reaction to the show on social media was pretty intense. We had a tweet put out by Ofsted during the programme where they said 70% of our inspectors currently work as senior leaders in schools. We understand the pressures that schools are under because many of us are working with those same pressures in our schools. That did not go down too well. Helen Williams said, so why say you have no evidence of the funding crisis affecting schools? She, of course, is giving reference to the comments by Amanda Spielman denying the fact there is a funding crisis in schools. We also had a comment from Craig Murray. Answer me this. Why do Ofsted not work with underperforming schools to help them improve? I mean, actually put a task force into the school. When you see a maths lesson being taught by a PE teacher, you have to ask questions and see the school needs help, not punishment. Following this, I actually published an article for the TES yesterday, which has had a lot of people engaging with it. And Ben Newmark made a comment on it saying, well, what do Ofsted do between inspections? So in the programme, I think there was a 12-week window. And the question was, well, what were Ofsted doing to help with the rapid, inverted commas, rapid improvement that they said they wanted? Are Ofsted not going to work with schools intensely to improve things and work with them to do that, rather than just, here's a judgment, we're going to come back in 12 weeks to make another judgment? So it's comments like that. And Nick Osborne, Ofsted needs to be focusing on the damage this ideological approach to education is having and refuse to do this. Government's beckoning. Stand up for teachers and against poor behaviour. And so on. The comments go on. There is a growing call, I think, for the abolition of the inspectorate. We talked about this on another podcast. So if you want to listen to that one, it's the first podcast, actually. Should Ofsted be abolished? It's worth listening to, and it's worth considering. Whether it should or shouldn't, I'm not sure. My personal view is yes, it should, but, obviously what replaces it would be important. My personal preference, as I've already said in this podcast, would be something along the lines of peer review. Anyway, reaction's pretty intense. The reaction continues from the programme and from the aftermath of the programme. So what do you think about school? This has been the Rebel Education Podcast. Please get in touch with me via Twitter if you have something to say on it. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think about the programme. Tweet me at Rogers History on Twitter, ROGERS History on Twitter. Follow the podcast on Spotify, Podbean and iTunes. I will see you next week for more on the Rebel Education Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Cheers all. Bye.